So we've seen a little bit about how to enter HTML code with CodeView. We can also use CodeView to edit our CSS. And let's take this opportunity to review the differences between HTML syntax and CSS syntax. We can see that in the style element here, along with the first few CSS properties that we have. A start tag in HTML has the name of the element, and then any attributes and their values are always preceded by a space. Attributes always appear in the start tag of an element, never in the end tag. So here, for example, I've got the style element. This is the start tag, and it's got a type attribute letting my browser know that the contents of this element are written in text that's been composed in the CSS language. There are a couple of other style sheet languages out there that are not as widely used as CSS, but it's good to just be sure just in case something new comes along. And then what's special about the style element is that in here, everything in between the start and the end tag of the style element is written in the CSS language, which has a different syntax. HTML has a syntax based on the standard generalized markup language, whereas CSS has a syntax more closely related to C++ and other classic programming languages. In CSS, we have this area known as the selector. In this case, we're selecting elements that have an ID attribute value of left, so that means it applies to this element down here, this div element that has an ID attribute with a value of left. And then inside these curly braces, we have our properties. We have the name of the property, such as position, followed by a colon, followed by the value absolute. Then we have a left property, a top property, width property. So there are differences in the syntax. Other than that, we have hints, we have code coloring, and all sorts of things to help us understand our CSS. For example, if I decide to change my position property, I type in the word position and then a colon, and then I get a contextual menu that gives me all of the different values that are valid for the position attribute. I had absolute before, and I don't necessarily want to change that, but I can see the other values here and choose them from the list. What I always want to remember is that CSS rules are always separated by a semicolon. Think of it as the period at the end of the sentence. So always make sure your CSS rules have a semicolon at the end. Otherwise, you can have a problem with how your browser interprets the display properties. If I have an external CSS file, for example, this page brings in an external style sheet using its link element. It brings in an external style sheet called sitestyle.css. And in Dreamweaver CS4, I can take a look at that file right up here. Here are all the rules that I applied to my external style sheet file. Now, the decision to have CSS in a style element in the head of your document or in an external style sheet depends on which aspects of a particular page's style you plan on having be universal to your site and which might be specific to a particular page. So, for example, let's say that I knew I always wanted all of my different div elements that have particular names, such as left or middle or right, that I always wanted them in the same location. Well, my style element contains all this information in just the local file. But if I wanted to, I could copy or even cut this information. I'll copy it for the time being and go over to my sitestyle.css file and put it in there. And now it will apply across my site. Before I take a look at whether or not it affected the second page, I want to point out that I see that here I have two different rules that apply to elements that are ID'd as left. And this is perfectly all right to do. I could take the time and edit them and combine them all into one if that's easier for me to remember where everything is, but it's no problem having two separate ones. If I have two contradictory rules in the two different sections, then the one that comes later will take precedence. But now that I have this position property for each of these elements set in my master site style file, if I go over to my second page, suddenly all of those boxes have been resized and moved so that they're in the exact same position as they are in the index file. So again, this is an example of how having an external style sheet file can really help us create a universal style for our site. Now again, I'm going to go over to my CSS file here. I'm going to go into code view so I can see the whole file. And if I want to enter a particular property, I can do that in the code. For instance, let's say I wanted to set a universal font for all of my pages. I can enter a new property rule. I often will do this on a new line within the curly braces, and when I do that, Dreamweaver assumes that I'm entering a new property, and it actually gives me all of the properties here. I'm going to set the font for the page, so I can choose the font property here, and this gives me the option to choose a group of font faces, such as, let's say, Times New Roman. And if I now refresh all that, and it's often a good idea to save everything, I can go to the File menu and choose Save All. And now that font's been applied, and if I want to change it, I can delete the colon there, and it will give me another. So if I want, let's say, a sans serif collection of fonts, something a little bit less formal looking, I can save that, and I've refreshed it. And now if I go back to my other pages, my font style has been changed to a sans serif collection of fonts. So, editing CSS in Dreamweaver is as simple as editing the HTML text.